Okay, so we are live for sure. I see it on Twitter. I also went live on YouTube this time. This is our first time. So we'll just wait for 2 minutes, let people join in, and then see where we headed.
Sounds good.
And I'll share it with people in our community as well, and Discord and Telegram.
Do the same thing from our side as well. 1 second.
Okay, we started getting people now. That's good. Okay, I think we can start. We have a good number of almost 500 people, and it's always gonna keep increasing. So, hello everyone. I'm your NN host Naruto. I'm a senior developer at Avail. We do not have a QEDK today because he's busy with important stuff that you'll see in next few weeks. But yeah, we have Particle Network today. We have Ethan, who is also goes with Tabasco, pretty unique name to me, and we'll just quickly talk to Ethan and everyone about what Particle Network is doing, what Avail is doing, and how we have formed a nice collaboration here today. So Ethan, quickly, if you can introduce yourself and like what you do at Particle Network and how's everything been going with you.
Yeah, definitely. Happy to. So, yeah, like I said, my name is Tabasco. That's at least the alias that I go by on Twitter. My real name is Ethan. I do developer relations here at Particle, so I handle all of our developer content. Do events like this. Go to a bunch of IRL events, stuff like that. And kind of the TLDR Particle Network is that. At least the tagline that we use is that we're the modular layer one blockchain powering chain abstraction. So kind of like throughout our entire lifespan, we've always been centered around kind of trying to solve a lot of the core like points of UX friction in the space. Historically, this has been like onboarding and account abstraction. So most of our history in the space spans kind of like doing social login solutions for getting users into NPC based accounts via things like Google, Twitter, stuff like that. We do a lot of account abstraction stuff as well, so AA infrastructure, and then now getting into 2024, we've been very focused on trying to solve like really what we believe to be one of the largest points of friction in the space, which is the idea of kind of multi-chain compatibility and getting users to leverage applications across the entire ecosystem in a way that's seamless and feels very Web2 like. And this is where this idea of chain abstraction comes in, which I'm sure we'll talk a little bit more about later. But at Particle, we're basically building our own blockchain and our own solution called Universal Accounts, which will essentially give users the ability to leverage applications across any chain with one address and one balance. So if I have USDT on Arbitrum and I have a USDT on Base, it's the same thing to me as a user. I can leverage this across any application, any chain, and it's very Web2 like. It kind of feels like a unified, kind of more streamlined experience. So this is kind of what we're building at Particle Network. We just released testnet last week, and we're moving pretty quickly. And of course, our chain itself uses this mechanism, which we'll also get into more, called aggregated DA, which has Avail at its center.
That's pretty interesting, and I have a lot of questions on aggregated DA. some follow-up questions as well. But let's move on to how you got in with Particle Network. How did your journey start? How did Particle Network start? What was the main reason when founders came up with the whole idea? What was the vision?
Yeah, so myself personally, I joined Particle Net back in September. Previously, I did developer relations at an RPC provider for around a year and a half, and a big reason why I joined Particle was whenever I was kind of looking into to moving, I came across Particle and this kind of idea which we were working on at that point, which was more focused on this kind of account abstraction social login side, which is really just trying to solve the point of onboarding friction, right? So like and this is really what we've been focused on for the past 2 years or so, which is how do we get users into the space in a way that's as easy as possible and really feels invisible, right? So, like at the end of the day, a lot of onboarding will happen through applications where people don't even really know they're using Web3, or if they do, it feels very natural to them. It feels very Web2 like. So, how do you get users into the space in a way where they don't have to, for example, write down a seed phrase or go and download some sort of wallet and stuff like this? How do you do this, to the same degree that we onboard people in Web2? And this is what Particle has been, quite focused on for a number of years now, starting with this kind of MPC based social login solution, which we built out for quite a while, and it's still one of our core products. And this led very closely into account abstraction. And today we're pretty much the largest account abstraction provider in the ecosystem by kind of volume of transactions or user operations. And this was all kind of for the effort of solving that point of friction, right? So not only how do we get users into accounts and into applications easily, but once we get them into the application, into an account, how do we make sure that this account and their actual interaction with this application is like super flexible, right? So this is where account abstraction came into the mix, and this is where it kind of made sense to start implementing smart accounts into the social login process and allow users to then, after they've onboarded via their Google or Twitter account, stuff like that, how do they then actually interact with the application? Well, with account abstraction, you could do things like, gasless transactions and pop-up list transactions and a lot of other kind of cool things that come as a result of this kind of, programmable account structure. So we've been very focused on kind of this side of things quite a bit, but kind of this journey started with that. And then, like I mentioned briefly, one thing that we noticed kind of being at the forefront of a lot of this more account focused or kind of like user facing like UX tooling was that it's great if you can create an application like that in a silo or in a vacuum has really good UX, which is now possible with social logins and account abstraction and really a lot of the SDKs that we've been making. That's great if you can do this in a silo of that single application. But as soon as a user onboards right into an application like this, it's has good UX, uses all these kind of different tools. And then they want to move to another application in Web3 and they want to use a different application on a different chain. This is where the UX breaks down a ton, right? So like this has always been a problem. This isn't even just a problem recently. This is like the incompatibility between chains and need to manually bridge things across chains and so on. It has always been a pretty major problem. So kind of our thought process has been, we've kind of started here at this account abstraction space and the kind of social login part of things and getting users into Web3 as easily as possible. And now we're transitioning this and kind of building upon these solutions towards a more kind of complete or I guess holistic approach to user experience, where not only can users onboard in a way that's easy, but actually this like UX is applicable to the entire ecosystem and it's sort of like universalized across all applications and all chains. So this is kind of the justification and kind of the path that we've been on that got us here.
Yep. So like back then in 2020, 2021, when I was, experimenting with all these, I remember the whole UX was so broken. So we have come a long way from there. Now we have multiple wallets, multiple different companies, building on it. I think I kind of like for now Rainbow Wallet I've been using more than MetaMask, so these kind of stuff. But in general as well, like the UX, I feel like it's still broken and can be improved when it comes to multiple chains. We have like hundreds of chains right now. I think I saw a tweet which said like L2 Beats is showing 95 chains. 42 are inactive or like coming up soon, and then 50ish or something, the same number around that, 53 or whatever, are like currently active in mainnet. So if we have so many chains, we need like better solutions for those as well, like one-click solution behind. It's definitely like agreed with what you're saying here. So like going back into like the technology part. First of all, like I would want you to explain it to some people what MPC really means. Like a lot of people understand MPC with just like words, but what it actually does under the hood, and what is like the underlying technology that like Particle is using, to bring these solutions in the Web3.
For sure, yeah. And yeah, it's a good question. I guess like the way that you can kind of see, at least the approach that we take to sort of what you might consider account-based chain abstraction. So chain abstraction that is really applied to the account level that allows users to kind of maintain these what we call universal accounts, which are, like I mentioned briefly earlier, the ability to kind of have one address and one balance that's kind of spanning all chains. There's kind of like, I guess, two types of accounts that can be a universal account, right? So one of which is going to be like an NPC secured account. So these are what we've been building historically, and kind of what our past SDKs and our past technologies have kind of have been built around, which is social logins primarily. And when you're doing social logins and you're getting users into the space via that mechanism, private key management is a little bit different, because you can't just kind of like ask somebody to necessarily write down a seed phrase or save a private key, because this is kind of antithetical to the idea of social logins and this Web2 like onboarding flow. So instead, you use this idea called or this kind of technology called MPC, which basically allows us in a few words or less just to onboard users via a mechanism where we can kind of have their private key in multiple different shares. So rather than a single private key, we can kind of split it almost into, in our case, two different shares. One share is saved with the user, the other share is saved within a trusted execution environment. And essentially, both of these shares can kind of work independently to then generate a part of a signature, which collectively allowed for the authentication of a given transaction. So in this case, you can actually create and use a wallet in a way where you never have to have or use like a single private key, and rather kind of remains distributed. And it makes it much easier for you to onboard users via things like social logins, and still, lack a full custodial mechanism, and make it far easier for people to actually kind of, use their account in a way that's as secure as possible. So this is kind of like the idea behind NPC-based accounts, and this is what we've been doing with social logins. Then moving past that, as we started to get into the account abstraction space and now universal accounts, the other type of account, which most people are kind of typically more familiar with, is traditional externally owned accounts. So things that come as a result of your MetaMask. Whenever you create a new account on MetaMask, this is an externally owned account. Or whenever you create a new account on Rainbow or something like this, these are externally owned accounts that you own the private keys to. You have the private key physically, or you write down a seed phrase or something like this. And this is how you interact with that account. So universal accounts, actually, you can kind of understand this as a smart account. So actually a smart contract wallet that exists on top of any typical account mechanism. So whether this is like an MPC secured externally owned account generated by a Particle social login, or whether this is like some sort of typical wallet like MetaMask or something like this, universal accounts basically are sort of like a layer on top of these account implementations that allow you as a user to kind of like use your underlying account that you already have through your wallet or through your social login as like a signer for this universal account, which then becomes your interface with the space. So this is kind of like at a high level how the kind of dynamic works here between MPC based accounts via social logins, more traditional wallets that you use on a day-to-day basis with your own seed phrase, and how each of these kind of independent private key mechanisms and account structures fit into universal accounts.
And this is the similar idea of the whole modular L1 that you're building, right? Like the powered with chain abstraction. This is the whole idea, or like there's something else left? Because I was reading the docs, and it like literally, it says that there are like wallet abstraction. I get the whole idea. There's also something like liquidity abstraction and gas abstraction. So what does that mean in general?
Yeah, so kind of the idea behind this universal account technology that we're working on, which it kind of exists to apply this idea of chain abstraction, which maybe I should kind of take a step back and I guess first define chain abstraction, because like chain abstraction is actually a relatively new idea, and it's been proliferating a lot throughout the ecosystem, and I'm sure everybody listening has probably heard of it before. But in essence, chain abstraction is just the idea of very simply like removing the barriers between chains. So how do you create like a user experience, or even just like infrastructurally, how do you kind of remove a lot of the actual barriers between chains, and how do you ultimately, like, to an end user, the idea of chain abstraction is to achieve this ideal of like, as a user, I go to an application, I start using it, and I don't even know, or I don't need to know what chain it's on. It's an irrelevant detail to me. It's like just infrastructure, right? So that's what chains are ultimately. I mean, they're infrastructure. They're like the things that back applications. It shouldn't be as in the face of users as it is today, because this is really what's led to a lot of the UX issues, because we have to be so cognizant of, no, I have my balance on on this chain and
Cool.
I want to interact on this chain and I have balances here, different balance. So let me go do this bridging mechanism and get to that chain. And then, okay, I want to go back, use a different bridge, and it's taking 10 minutes. I mean, the fact that we need like, we expect users to be like, oh, actually I'm using Arbitrum, I'm using Solana, I'm using this and this. This is I think a symptom of a pretty like of a new industry that hasn't really adapted to what is like a more typical Web2 like of, you're just kind of removing the actual infrastructure from end users and they're just using applications. It's just the user and the application. The chain should be removed from that equation. So this is really the idea of chain abstraction. And to achieve this on the account level, which is how we're doing it with universal accounts, which is basically just like any application that uses our SDK has users onboarded by universal accounts. These are, like I said, either social logins or typical wallets that they want to connect. They get into a universal account. They fund this universal account with, USDT, the native token of the network, whatever they want to do. And then they can use this balance across every blockchain and every application so that truly we can kind of achieve this idea of not having to be cognizant of the underlying blockchain. And just, you have your balance, you have your wallet, and you just use it, right, across any application. But to power this, I mean, this is a relatively ambitious idea because, blockchains still, as much as we probably want to fix it, blockchains have a lot of inherent incompatibility with one another, and bridging is complicated. Moving funds across chains is complicated. So to kind of, I guess, be the backing of this idea of universal accounts, we needed an L1. We needed a chain that could basically act as sort of a very large piece of infrastructure. So our chain isn't going to be something that necessarily users will kind of interact with directly as if it were to be like an Arbitrum or something like that. Rather, the chain is basically just kind of a very back-end piece. It's just infrastructure that kind of powers universal accounts. So whenever I do a transaction with the universal account, it'll actually pass through the chain to some degree, where the chain will actually be responsible for the kind of deconstruction and processing of this transaction, and then ultimately its execution. Because, let's say I want to do some transaction that's worth 10 USDC on base, right? But all my balances are moved between, they're kind of split between Ethereum and Arbitrum. So, typically I'd have to go to deal this manually, but what we can do in the case of universal accounts is that actually this will communicate with our chain, and our chain will say, okay, well, we have this transaction. We want to use 10 USDC on base. We have all these balances on Arbitrum and on ETH. So what do we actually do? Well, we can do transaction A, transaction B, transaction C, transaction D to then move these balances over to base and do in a way that's very fast. So our chain says, okay, here's a sequence of transactions that we need to do. Let's go ahead and execute each of these on behalf of the user using the same signature that they signed the original transaction with. And then it'll move all these balances over to the chain that they're doing the transaction on, to the same condition that the transaction requires. And then through the same signature in roughly 10 seconds, actually execute the transaction. So the user doesn't know that any of this happened. They just sign the transaction, and in the backend, our chain is going through all this kind of computation, all this execution logic, and then kind of moving all these funds accordingly from whatever chains that they have their balances on to the chain that they're doing the transaction on, and then it's going through. So it's basically just like this big settlement layer, this big coordination layer that is actually facilitating the movement of these funds and the movement of liquidity across chains. So this is where this idea of universal liquidity comes in, which powers universal accounts. And that's all facilitated by the means of the chain.
It's basically a route, right? Like if I want to move it to like base and I'm on, let's say, Blast, I have a USDC or whatever. So the route is decided and it just all happens in the back. And I don't need to do it myself, right? Because I had to pay someone recently and I had to pay like a few $100s. So they asked me, oh, can you send like 50% of it in base and then 50% on ARB? I don't know why they asked it. But if I had to do this, now I'm converting my Ethereum USDC to bridging it. And then from bridging, I'm doing to ARB. Then from ARB, I'm sending it again. So it just takes a lot of clicks. There's like so many steps, which I want to avoid as a user, as an end user, or even as a dev, So definitely very interesting. I think that's a right way to go. So yeah, moving along, what I wanted to ask, like, we Particle Network and Avail, we've been like having some collaborations. So what is like the inspiration you think is the right on why we have collaborated? What do you think, like there are some goals that we are achieving together, and where we fit in together?
Yeah, so Avail has always been like one project that we have felt particularly aligned with. I think partly because of kind of this unification idea that Avail is focused on through Nexus and these kind of different components that really do contribute significantly to this. I mean, ultimately, this goal of the ecosystem that we're trying to push for, which is a unified kind of like universally interoperable ecosystem of chains where it's very easy and ultimately seamless to kind of move funds and share security and stuff like this. But I think just like fundamentally, Avail's mission has always been very aligned with ours, especially in regards to chain abstraction and kind of interoperability and whatnot. But I think on the DA side, at Particle, when we're kind of designing our chain, which to kind of to reiterate, is basically just this piece of infrastructure that will kind of power the mechanism of universal accounts. We wanted to use external DA, so we wanted to kind of move DA from our own chain to different external sources, because of course this is the kind of modularization of blockchains. It makes things more efficient, makes things better. So we wanted to do this, but we wanted to do so in a way where we weren't necessarily bound to a single DA layer, because of the nature of universal accounts and kind of I guess you can understand it as like the importance of the chain in terms of kind of being as robust and resilient as possible. We wanted to make sure that we could not only kind of increase the efficiency and optimize for the best DA layer to use in a given scenario or a given condition, but also kind of simultaneously do so in a way where we can also increase security and reduce kind of reliance on a single vendor, and do like redundant publishing, right? So these are all important things that we believe really kind of embody this thesis of modularity. So to do this, we kind of came up with this idea of aggregated DA, which very simply just kind of allows us to kind of either do what we call selective publishing or redundant publishing between multiple DA layers. Now, Avail is one of these kind of core DA layers we support, and for good reason. We believe that Avail has a really unique value proposition in terms of its DAO support, validity proofs, kind of these different components that make it pretty different from kind of the other core DA layers, and also make it something that we expect to be using quite a bit within the chain, as opposed to some of the others that we're going to support. We're going to be using all of them, kind of within the same idea of like aggregation and kind of balancing between multiple different DA layers. And Avail, with this specific DA solution that Avail provides, we are quite aligned with it, and we believe that infrastructurally it'll play a pretty big role in terms of actually providing Particle and our chain with kind of the I guess resilience that it needs on the DA side. So this is kind of our concept of aggregated DA, and it's something that we're kind of building out. Actually, I believe Avail did a bounty or a prize to a recent ETH Global hackathon winner called it was called a Pan DA or Panda from
Yes.
and we had a conversation with them because we noticed it, and I was like, this is an amazing project, and it's very aligned with this kind of idea that we had. So I think there's multiple builders that are kind of going towards a solution. We really like how Hashi approached it, and we think that this is like a direction that in general makes a lot of sense for the industry. So we're pretty excited about getting this ready to go, and of course Avail kind of being a core part of that.
Yeah, I remember. I think I was using Pandier because I think it's Eat Global London. I think I just looked at it or was using it. It was actually a pretty good idea, like abstraction layer for TAs. A lot of they put in a lot of thoughts, and they included pretty much as many as roll-ups as well they can do, I think. And then they had I think some kind of they had Gnosis, Celestia, even Celestia, and then Ethereum. That was a pretty good idea. And it's pretty interesting that you guys reached out to it. That just means how Avail or Particle Network are so supportive of these projects that are coming along. They the people who built on at the hackathons, and then they just end up being reached out by these projects for maybe a grant or maybe to make it production ready. This is what we hope out of these hackathons, and I think this is a good example of what Eat Global does. It's definitely a good idea. Just wanted to point out, you have a particle network background, I think it's like neon lighting. That looks pretty good.
Sure.
It's very nicely designed. I just noticed that.
Yeah, it was. I bought it a few months ago. It was actually not that bad. It's a big LED sign. You can't see it. It's kind of like plastered in acrylic, and it's huge. It's like I think it's.
Does it change colors as well?
It does. Yeah, I have like a remote. I can make it any color or stuff like that. I usually keep it as like this kind of the color of our logo, but I can switch it to any color. It's a pretty standard kind of LED setup. I think it wasn't that much. It was like maybe $100 or something like that.
That's
and
not
it's
bad.
really worth it. Yeah, it makes the room look pretty good.
Yeah, I think I need to get one, and I can put it somewhere in my room. I don't know if you saw it, Nader. So he posted one of the times like he had sneakers, and then the sneakers had like eigen layers or like those kind of like logos, which is pretty cool. Like these are like very nice idea for representations, just because some cool stuff.
Yeah, we were also at the Avail Hot Take Series fragmentation event in Dubai.
Mhm.
We were one of the sponsors of that, and there's plenty of Avail merch there. We had the opportunity to pick a few up, and that was a really good event. And there's a lot of really cool builders over there as well. So it's kind of bleeding into the real world a little bit.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. We'll have like similar things at ACC. So for sure, like if you're there, we're gonna meet for sure. Um, okay, moving on. So one question was like, you explained a little bit about aggregated TA. Can you like go a little bit deeper and like what's the major reason on like choosing this solution? I understand like what aggregated TA means, but how does it look like to the end user? Like, does he feel any kind of difference? How does it, feel to roll-ups or anyone else, working with you? What kind of like do they incur more cost, less cost, more security, that kind of question?
Yeah, it's a good question. And we have kind of gone through a few different models for aggregated DA, and we've kind of settled on this idea of kind of two different types of publishing. And kind of alluded to this briefly a moment ago. But essentially, you have kind of number one, what we call selective publishing. Now, selective publishing is that whenever
Yep.
conditions permit, essentially we are publishing data to only one DA layer. So we have data from a block, we're only publishing it to one specific DA provider. And this is usually out of the means of efficiency. So what results in the lowest cost, what's the most efficient for us to do in a given time. And this way we can actually analyze the conditions of multiple different networks and kind of what works best for us, and then actually use that accordingly. And this will actually decrease costs, makes things a little bit easier for end users. Of course, not obviously, it's kind of all going to be in the back end, but it'll feel a little bit more seamless and just that a little bit more kind of natural for end users. This kind of second part of this is also what we believe to be quite important, which is redundant publishing. So in many cases, we can actually do publishing across all of the different data layers that we support. Now, this is very important because this means that we don't rely on the kind of the reliability of a given data layer, and we can actually utilize multiple and therefore kind of have, I guess, better availability for our data. So this is kind of the two mechanisms of publishing that we use with an aggregated DA. In many cases, selective publishing for efficiency, redundant publishing for kind of increased security, increased availability, stuff like this. This is kind of like the core idea behind aggregated DA. Now, for end users, the kind of effects that this will have will be mostly just kind of, you'll notice that there's going to be a higher degree of efficiency. Generally, fees will be a little bit lower because the network overall is going to be more efficient with selective publishing. And of course, for us, it means that we have less vendor lock and we have higher data availability assurances, which is very important because what we really believe, and this is honestly how we've kind of like structured our chain overall, and we have more than just aggregated DA that kind of contributes to this idea. We believe that to kind of build a chain that actually is responsible for being kind of this universal settlement layer of chain abstraction, kind of the multi-chain ecosystem, it needs to be highly resilient, highly robust. It can't be kind of like there can't really be any components of the chain that could fall to a single point of failure or rely on one component too much, because if this is the case, then these universal accounts, they rely on the chain to ultimately do the transactions. So the chain itself needs to be very robust and needs to be constantly available and kind of constantly have a high degree of integrity to make sure that we can actually do these transactions effectively, get the best routes. Everything remains cheap and seamless for end users. So to do this, aggregated DA is one of the kind of core components that we kind of allow for this. And the second part of this, which is a little bit more complicated, we don't have to get into it too much, is basically just this idea of dual staking. So our actual consensus model is going to be secured by our native token, as well as BTC via Babylon. So if anybody has heard of kind of Babylon, what they're doing, we're actually going to be using BTC to kind of secure a second set of operators that will contribute to our consensus. There's another kind of thing that contributes to this idea of building a very resilient chain that will be available at all times and be highly reliable in terms of constantly being this kind of universal settlement layer for universal accounts. Because without kind of these assurances, if we were to be reliant on just one DA layer, and if we were to have kind of like a consensus mechanism that was too reliant on like a relatively volatile token, then these are things that could ultimately affect end users and how they leverage universal accounts. So it's very important that we kind of avoid that and be as, I guess, distributed as possible. So this is really kind of where the justification of aggregated DA came in. And you will see better efficiency for end users. You're going to see more security overall when it comes to redundant publishing. And we're pretty excited about kind of the implementation of this. We've gone through a lot of different models, and like I said, you have a lot of builders that are also kind of going through the same idea. And we believe that this will hopefully turn into a more kind of common approach where, this will kind of embody the idea of modular to some degree, and really allow us, at least at Particle, will allow us to be significantly more resilient and reliable than we would have been without it.
Interesting. So going back to like Bitcoin, BTC, and Batman, like it wasn't like it just came up, and it's just a follow up question because I was going through documentation and I saw something like chain abstraction for Bitcoin L2s, right? So I see like you guys have been doing something with B squared and Satoshi VM. So what are your like plans with the chain abstraction, and how does it work like moving forward? Like I know like you cleared it a little bit while you were explaining the whole thing, but are there like something that goes deeper and how valuable it is for like the Bitcoin users, because the Bitcoin community is so big, So what do you think about that?
Yeah, the Bitcoin layer 2 ecosystem has been one that we've looked a lot at, and honestly, I think like the entire ecosystem has been kind of eyes on Bitcoin layer 2s recently, especially like you've seen a lot of like really good modular Bitcoin layer
Yep.
2s and a lot of innovation in that space. I mean, for good reason. I did this talk at Bitcoin Day by ABCDE in Hong Kong a few weeks ago, and essentially kind of like one of the big points that I made was that so far in 2024, like one of the biggest kind of technologies that have taken off has been Bitcoin layer 2s. I mean, at this point, I think we have like over 80 of them that are of pretty decent size. And at Particle, we kind of noticed that this was happening and this trend was happening. We noticed this back in kind of January, February. But kind of one of the core issues that we initially noticed, and this was before we started focusing too much on chain abstraction as an idea, but we noticed that kind of like the tooling between Bitcoin itself, so native Bitcoin and Bitcoin layer 2s, was pretty fragmented. So for example, Unisat is a wallet that most Bitcoin users use, and it's very popular. So if I'm a Bitcoin user and I'm leveraging Unisat every day, and then I want to go to a Bitcoin layer 2, which is supposed to be kind of like, an extension of Bitcoin or like a scalability solution for Bitcoin and kind of very tied to Bitcoin itself. And, I'm ultimately creating this ecosystem around Bitcoin. I actually can't use my Unisat wallet. I can't use my Xverse wallet, and I can't use any other wallet that I'm using on native Bitcoin that is leveraging my Bitcoin account. And of course, this makes sense because you're using an EVM chain typically, and these are incompatible account standards. So of course, you're going to use MetaMask or Wallet Connect or something like this. But this is kind of an issue because this means that if I'm a Bitcoin user, I want to go to a Bitcoin layer 2, I have to learn, download, and kind of fund a completely new account. So this is like something that makes it very difficult for me as an end user. I have to go and like basically just onboard to the Ethereum ecosystem. So it's almost not even like the Bitcoin ecosystem in that sense. It's just Ethereum that uses Bitcoin for settlement or uses Bitcoin for DA or whatever it may be. So kind of the idea behind what we released earlier this year, which we call BTC Connect, this is kind of like our flagship product and what we kind of consider to be an initial implementation of chain abstraction to some degree for the Bitcoin ecosystem, is basically the ability to use native Bitcoin wallets for EVM Bitcoin layer 2s. So with BTC Connect, if you're going to an application that enables it, you can actually use your Unisat wallet and directly leverage that same wallet interface on any EVM compatible Bitcoin layer 2. And we can basically like, in simple terms, generate like a smart account on that Bitcoin layer 2 and sign transactions for it using your native Bitcoin wallet. So it's pretty cool. You can basically use all the kind of tooling that you're already familiar with on Bitcoin, and it translates pretty much one-to-one on these Bitcoin layer 2s, and therefore allows you to use any wallet that you want on Bitcoin layer 2s. So I can use any Bitcoin wallet, any EVM wallet, and it kind of all functions the same way. I have, a smart account that I can start using. So this is kind of what we released back a few months ago. And now it's been integrated across pretty much every major Bitcoin layer 2 that's out there, and used across a pretty large volume of applications. So we've been pretty happy about that. Although we see Bitcoin as just another chain that ultimately needs to be abstracted, to be honest, and just something that kind of can be a part of this sort of collective of chains. So this is actually BTC Connect and kind of all of the accounts and things that we've generated from BTC Connect, along with all of the accounts we've generated by social login. So everything that's been made through our solutions up to this point, BTC Connect, social logins, account abstraction, and so on. What we're going to end up doing once we release chain abstraction in our full solution stack is going to be actually onboarding automatically all of these accounts to being universal accounts. So if you already have, for example, an account via BTC Connect with the Unisat wallet, or if you already have a social login smart account, what's going to happen is actually these will automatically upgrade to a universal account, in the next few months, and will automatically kind of be applied to this whole like chain abstraction thesis, and you'll be able to like leverage your balances across any chains, and it'll be pretty seamless. So we're kind of going to be immediately onboarding like hopefully the entire Bitcoin ecosystem into this sort of chain abstraction ideal where you'll be able to interact with any Bitcoin layer 2, and even Bitcoin itself through like a single wallet interface, a single balance, stuff like this. So this is something that we're pretty excited about, and we believe that the Bitcoin ecosystem is growing pretty quickly, and there's a lot of cool stuff happening over there.
Yeah, that's very interesting because onboarding like majority of Bitcoin is like I think the biggest game there is because everything started with Bitcoin, right? And then I think it was last year or a year and a half ago when ordinals came out. So I was running like an ordinals node, or like the Bitcoin node, and then everything that. So inscription just took off. From inscriptions we came to Bitcoin L2. So it's a big thing, honestly, saying that if we can onboard like majority of the BTC L2s, BTC users, definitely very interesting. Okay. Moving on. So, we talked about a little bit about aggregated DA. We, sidetracked and talked a little bit about BTC L2s. Another question for you is like a big part of like, what we all are working is like enabling the modular Web3 future. So what it really means that chains across all stacks are being built, similar to tens of thousands of microservices, but how it scales today, like, what do you think is the future for the modularism? Do you think we've gone too far in using the modularism versus monolithic competition, like, that kind of wording just for the hype? Or do you think like we're scaling really big, really well?
Yeah, this is actually something that we've been thinking a lot about, over the past few months. And honestly, it was a big part of our justification for kind of building this chain abstraction solution because, ultimately we're going in this direction of, modularity and modular blockchain architecture. And ultimately we're going into this direction of app chains, application specific blockchains and rollups. And the future that honestly I think is most likely is we're going to see thousands of rollups and thousands of app chains, and really to this like transition of applications over to app chains. So this is a trend that's been happening very quickly, and it's just really like it's resulting in a very large quantity of chains. And this isn't a bad thing. I mean, ultimately, what this means that we have a pretty solid answer to like the scaling issue, which is scaling has always been a problem within like the context of monolithic chains. Even I mean, I love Solana, but there's been some issues over there as well. And like this kind of idea of modular approach to scaling and doing so in a way where you have just like a lot of different interconnected blockchains. This tends to work better, and modular and having sovereign block space and stuff like this. I mean, this is ultimately at least what we believe to be a pretty solid approach to scaling. And the issue, though, is that even if you take this approach to scaling, which is quite ironclad and has a lot of really good potential to honestly be the answer to a lot of the problems in the space as it relates just to scaling, the issue, though, is that if you all of a sudden have 1,000 blockchains or 10,000 blockchains, whatever it may be, the fragmentation issue is only amplified significantly, right? I mean, today,
Yep.
there's, like you mentioned, I think L2Bit has around 100. I think in total, there's probably a few hundred like rollups or L2s that kind of exist today. And still, the fragmentation issue is one of the biggest issues in the space. So just imagine that if you had thousands, right? So this is this. I think if we do continue going down the route of like a modular thesis to scaling and kind of like focusing on just building applications on app chains and maintaining sovereign block space and kind of scaling independently from monolithic chains, which I think is the way that we're going, and I think it's the correct way to go. I think this is only possible in the context of chain abstraction. So this approach really isn't practical if this fragmentation continues to exist into this future with thousands of rollups, because at that point it will just be Web3 will become relatively unusable because of that UX friction that's present between chains and the lift that's required to do so. So chain abstraction, at least the way that we see it, will actually be the unlock that will allow Web3 to kind of scale to this degree with a modular design. Because at this point, if you have chain abstraction, which ultimately gets rid of all of the kind of differences between chains on the user level and really just kind of unifies everything into one user experience where you don't really care about the chain that you're using, then all of a sudden you can use every application that you use can be on an app chain. You can use 1,000 different chains a day and not really know it. And if this is possible, then there's no downside really to like you know, 1,000, 10,000, 1,000,000 roll up future, because at that point, the consequences of doing so, at least on the UX level, aren't there. They are there today because chain abstraction hasn't really been achieved on the ecosystem level yet, and that's what we're hoping to contribute to pretty significantly. But once that's ready, then I think that's really going to be one of the main points of unlock for a truly like, you know, modular future where scalability is done through this kind of like high volume of blockchains that are truly interconnected with one another, and that on a user level feel as if like I'm just using one chain, but of course in reality it's just I'm using a bunch of different app chains or different applications, and of course they're all like independently very scalable because of that.
For sure, for sure. So a follow-up question on that, okay? And this is like one of the hot takes, and that's why we have a name, Hot Take Series, because it's like taking spicy takes or opinions. And one of the things now I'm noticing, and this goes for us at Avail, this goes at like for most people as well, is that everyone's trying to get to the aggregation. Everyone is building their own aggregated layer or a unification layer, or like trying to get that abstraction and make the UX seamless. But don't you think like at the same time we are making multiple solutions, and then people or the end user gets confused where to go, and then it again becomes a similar what do you call it, similar fragmentation issue? What do you think about that?
Yeah, I like that you brought this up, because this is also something that we've actually been producing a lot of content about, and that
Yeah.
we've been thinking a lot about. Because like you're right, if we try to go the route of chain abstraction and like aggregation and unification, and we end up with 100 solutions that are doing different things and going in different directions to achieve it, then the problem has not been solved. You still have fragmentation, and you have fragmentation in the fragmentation solutions. So like this is something that, of course, needs to be avoided. But how you go about doing this is relatively nuanced. Really, what we like to reference pretty often is Frontier Research released this framework called the Cake framework, and this is in the context of chain abstraction specifically, which essentially is kind of this mental model or this way of understanding chain abstraction, kind of in the context of a stack of a lot of kind of like lower level primitives and interoperable solutions that collectively create chain abstraction. So we kind of subscribe to this idea that chain abstraction won't necessarily be achieved by one individual solution or organization. Chain abstraction is actually a larger, more ambitious goal of the ecosystem that, kind of like account abstraction, can only be achieved through multiple different technologies that are all contributing to it from different layers, and even standards that kind of unify these different solutions and create a much more kind of straightforward direction to go in terms of those that are building these solutions. So we kind of, and actually I was just on a space before this with Agoric, Socket, and Skip
Yeah.
protocol,
Yeah.
which we're kind of talking about this idea of like application level chain abstraction and orchestration, like how we think about this, in terms of the stack there. And we do believe that like at the end of the day, really what's going to result in like a complete like chain abstraction future is going to be, you're going to have a lot of different solutions that are kind of like working towards, for example, application level chain abstraction. So things that just are in the scope of like enabling chain abstraction on an application level, meaning as a developer, I can kind of like break my application from the confines of a given chain, and I can like very seamlessly interact with the entire multi-chain ecosystem. Then you have account level chain abstraction, which we believe also is kind of this idea of, this is ultimately what we're building towards, which is the idea of applying chain abstraction on the actual account level, and ultimately allowing users to have this unified balance, unified address, stuff like that across all chains. Then even a step above that, you have other solutions that we also believe will probably play a role in this future, which is like blockchain level chain abstraction. So it's like the Polygon AG layer, or even like Optimism Superchain or stuff like this, right? So this is almost like its own form of chain abstraction. And you can even break this down even further, where you can start to get into like lower level parts of it and like how all these will interact. I think that like there's kind of two parts to this. Number one is, of course, the collaborative part of this will make it a little bit easier to kind of go in a one direction that will, not a lot of different solutions that are all trying to solve the problem in whole, but rather a lot of solutions that are kind of approaching it from different angles at different parts of the stack. Whereas like they're going to have probably different types of stacks that you can go towards, and kind of it'll be ultimately modular in terms of how you actually want to achieve chain abstraction. So I think this future is probably the most likely, but also a lot of this will hopefully be unified through things like standards. And this is what, for example, Frontier Research focuses a lot on, is how do we unify a lot of these efforts towards, like ultimately being like collected under a given standard that we can then use to achieve chain abstraction in a way that isn't fragmented. So I think these two things, from the collaborative approach that chain abstraction and really unification will have to, the potential of even like collecting them under standards, I think this makes a lot of sense, and hopefully will allow us to avoid some of these issues that come up whenever you, for example, have 1,000 competing solutions.
For sure. I think that's what we have been talking about earlier as well. Like, what we do when we reach that point, which is a little bit in future, but for sure, definitely, achievable, and we will get there probably sooner than later. So, we need to look at all the directions where we are headed and what we've been, doing, all those kind of stuff, sort of things. So anyway, I have like one final thing for you, and this is, like coming from the experience at working at Avail, and then, you working at Particle Network. A lot of things like when we work in Web3, because Web3 moves so fast, a lot of things like, go right, a lot of things go wrong. When we're building bigger projects, working with multiple partners, all these things, right? So what are like some challenges that you faced? They can be technical, they can be non-technical partnerships or something like that, which you can talk about, of course. Theoretical practice, and what do you think are the solutions to that? Then according to you, and this is like just on personal level, on particle, and on your experience, rather than like talking about, let's say, seamless user experience or something like that.
Yeah, I think there's kind of, I guess, a few ways to tackle that. I think that some of the kind of core challenges for us, at least in kind of building the solution, and like I think first of all, like the idea of kind of universal accounts is a relatively novel thing, and it's kind of like a first of its kind, if that makes sense. Or like it hasn't really been done before
For sure.
necessarily. So this presents a lot of interesting technical challenges for us, and like things that we are currently in the process of like kind of figuring out, how to do effectively. I think one of these things is, just I mean, honestly, a problem that's kind of been approached in the space for a long time, which is like how do you do safe bridging in a way that is quick. I mean, just as a very simple problem and challenge. We have a few kind of ways that we're going about it. We've detailed kind of a few of our approaches in the blog, but just from a technical perspective, it's kind of difficult because if you want to do a bridging transaction in less than 15 seconds, right? But you want this to simultaneously be secure, then there's kind of like almost like a trade-off there, where it's like if you want to be pretty fast, and sometimes there's some there's some security things that you're maybe foregoing versus if you want it to be maximally secure, then maybe it takes a little bit longer because you have more robust verification features and stuff like this. But we have kind of a few models that we're looking into. We have this kind of idea of a system of bundlers and relayers and kind of different types of nodes that will kind of like simultaneously work with solutions like Hyperlane and Layer Zero and stuff like this to push through transactions in a way that's very dynamic and hopefully allow us to achieve almost like, we really like Across. We think that what they built and how they've achieved, like a lot of their kind of bridging transactions go through in under 20 seconds. We like their model, so we've thought a lot about kind of like a similar approach to that and a few other kind of things that are related to that. So that's kind of one, like at least on the technical side. Also kind of on the kind of, I guess the other side could be maybe almost like cultural in the space and kind of like how we approach solving problems. I think a lot of it has also been like, a big part of why we've been advocating for this idea of what we just talked about, which is kind of like this collaborative approach to chain abstraction. I think a lot of the time, sometimes the space is seen almost as like especially in kind of new emerging fields, as like zero sum, as in like there's going to be one solution that wins, and like that's kind of the end of it. But we don't really see it from this perspective, and we think that honestly, it's kind of we've been trying to push very hard on this idea that chain abstraction, and I really like the whole interoperability space and kind of this idea of UX in Web3 is definitely ultimately a positive sum game. And it's not something that's going to be owned by a single organization or a single solution. Like I mentioned earlier, I mean, it requires collaboration. It requires a stack of different solutions that kind of shine in their own right on different parts of the stack. And we believe that this is honestly like a cultural shift that needs to happen. And like on a large scale, and this is why we've been pushing pretty hard on that. Because like I think a big part of the ethos of Web3 as well is pretty deeply collaborative. And something that maybe isn't embraced enough. I think there's a lot of competition in the space in sectors where maybe there needs to be less of it and more of kind of a more unified, working towards specific kind of goal. And this is also kind of where we really like what Frontier Research is doing, for example, with their working group of different organizations that have kind of agreed to work on unified standards and stuff like that. of which we've kind of been participating in as well. So I think like one challenge that definitely we've been trying to address, apart from like the technical side of, for example, just like achieving very easy interoperability that's fast and secure, is kind of this cultural issue of like how do you really push towards a truly like collaborative solution, and what needs to be a pretty large paradigm shift in this space that has to be collaborative, in a space that a lot of the time is somewhat competitive in nature. But we think that there's been a lot of good progress in this over like the past few months, and there's been a lot of organizations that have kind of bought into this idea with us of like, there needs to be this kind of like unified front of organizations that are all contributing to this. And of course, this started with Frontier Research, and we're trying to kind of push this idea as well from our side, and hopefully move the needle on this kind of idea of competition to collaboration. And I think this also embodies pretty deeply this idea of modularity and kind of like the Web3 ethos overall. So this has also been kind of like a challenge that we've been very, very focused on, just from like a purely messaging perspective, and how we're kind of interacting with the space from that angle.
Yeah, I really think like, with so many chains, so many protocols coming in, and like this whole social fi games and all these things, everyone is competing for that small pie of users, so everyone has been like so competitive lately. But I also believe like people are like, starting to understand that everyone headed to the same direction. It's not like, we are against each other. It's basically we are working to something. So definitely very agreed on that. We need more and more collaborative things to do. So yeah, completely agreed on most of the points here. Most of the points I see what you guys have been doing. It's a fun thing learning from you about particle smart wallets, or like chain abstraction, the BTCL2, and the aggregated DA. One of my favorite topics that you talked about today. Final thing, like how can people reach out to you if they want to collaborate, or like get updates where they can follow you? I'll still put it. I think we've already marketed it a lot, but you still want to say some kind of like Twitter or anything, goodbye note, anything like that way.
Yeah, so you can always follow us at Particle NTWRK on Twitter, or I'm at Tabasco Web here on Twitter. I post mostly more technical developer content typically, and you can also go to particle.network or blog.particle.network to kind of learn a little bit more. For some context, we're getting ready to launch our testnet, or we launched our first testnet phase last week, and we're getting ready to launch the second phase of our testnet over the coming weeks, and that will lead into mainnet, later in kind of early Q3. So we have a lot of kind of exciting things that are planned, over the next few quarters as it comes to releasing testnet, mainnet, and so on. And of course, this will include, eventually aggregated DA and kind of these different components that we're pretty excited about. So definitely go to our blog and our website. We have a lot of kind of cool things in the works, and we're hoping to, over the next few months, start to roll out these solutions and kind of see what the community thinks.
Yeah, definitely. I think I saw the announcement 2nd of May or something. That's when the testnet launched. 2nd or 3rd May, I don't remember. Like just 3 days back. Definitely gonna play around the testnet, go through the docs this weekend. That's my homework, I think. But yeah, it was nice to having you here, Ethan. I think like our collaboration with Avail and Particle is gonna be really good. Hopefully, I'll meet you in person at HCC. And if there's anything else, like, reach out to me.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thanks again for having me on. This is awesome. Really good questions. And looking forward to meeting up at ECC and continuing the conversation from there.
Great. So I'm just going to end the stream. But everyone, thank you for listening in. Someone said Naruto is my hero. I don't know what I've done. I'll just like highlight that Erode person. Thanks a lot. I don't know what I've done to do this, but yeah, thank you. I'm just going to end the stream now. Thanks, everyone.